Hey guys, I want to share a fun technique I discovered for creating string parameters that can expand and collapse in the interface. There are a couple ways of going about doing it, but I like the method I'm about to show because it works well inside multiparm blocks like this one, where you might have several parameters with the same template, but you only want to be able to expand and collapse them one at a time. We're going to start with a simple version using just a single string parameter that can expand and collapse. And then at the end of the video, we'll build upon this base and make it work inside of a multiparm block. So if we look inside, we can see that we're actually going to do this by using 4 different parameters. Right off the bat here, we can see that we have 2 string parameters, one called note collapsed and one called note expanded. But if we show the invisible parameters, we're also adding in a toggle, as well as a section to keep some custom code that we're going to write to make it all work together. And we're also going to be adding these action buttons here, which are the little buttons at the end of the parameter with an icon to do the toggling for us. So now that we've seen what we're going to make and we've had a quick glance at what the sort of guts inside look like, let's start building this from scratch. So to get started, I'm going to create a null object, and straight off the bat, I'm going to select all of the parameters that are currently there and make them invisible because we don't need to see that. We just want a clean slate. And then I'm going to add a string parameter, 2 of them actually, and a toggle. I'll start by naming the first string parameter note collapsed, and I'm going to give it the label of just note. I'll name the second one note expanded, and I'm also just going to call that one note. We'll give 2 different internal names to the string parameters, but we're going to keep the label the same to add to the illusion that this is the same string parameter, just expanding and collapsing, even though we're actually going to be using 2 separate ones. For the toggle, I'm going to call that one expanded, and it's going to hold basically the state of our system here, whether or not we're viewing the expanded version or the collapsed version. So when I hit apply and we can see all the parameters here, we can see that both of the note strings look the same, and we actually want to have one that's a little bit bigger. So we want to come back to the note expanded parameter here and enable this multi-line string option. And we can see that we get a big block of text here. I like to change the lines to show to something more like 5 to 10. And that just means we're going to see fewer lines from the start. And then once we hit 10 lines, we'll start to see the scroll bar rather than the parameter just expanding bigger and bigger. So it's all a little bit messy right now, but we're going to tidy this up later. Don't worry. So the first thing we should do is to get this expanded toggle to actually do something. So what should we have it do first? Well, let's see how we can use it to show and hide these different parameters. Because when the toggle is set to expanded, we don't want to see this smaller one. We only want to see the bigger one. And when it's off, we only want to see the small single line string parameter, and we want to hide the big one. So to do that, we can come to either one of these note string parameters, and under the hide when field here, we can use a special syntax to hide it based on the value of a parameter on this node. So I'm going to say curly brace expanded. When expanded is equal to 1, I want to hide the collapsed string parameter. I'm going to copy this, head over to note expanded and paste it, because when expanded is equal to 0, I want to hide the big one. So I'll hit apply, and we'll see that the expanded one disappears. And now if I check the toggle button, we can see that we're flipping between our collapsed and expanded version of the string. I'll link to the documentation where you can read a bit more about that syntax in greater detail. That'll be in the description below. So now we have all this hooked up, and the toggle is controlling which string parameter we see. So that's pretty cool. And that means we're pretty close already. Our next problem is that the text doesn't actually come along when we change the state from collapsed to expanded. And of course not, it's because we haven't actually built that in yet. Currently, we have to copy the text from this string parameter and paste it into the other and do that back and forth. So if I say something like, hey there, and we check on expanded, we can see that the text doesn't come along for the ride. What we'd have to do is we need to copy this, Control A, Control C, Control V, add a little bit more, Control A, Control C, Control V, and that's really not very user-friendly to have to copy and paste back and forth. We wanted Houdini to do this for us automatically. So let's implement something a bit more slick. I'm going to actually undo the hide when set up temporarily just because I want you guys to be able to see what's going on in the next few steps. So come to both of these parameters, get rid of that hide when. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a callback script to this toggle that does some copying and pasting for us. A callback is something that runs when the parameter is interacted with. And we're actually not going to just copy and paste between the two parameters. We want to make sure that these two string parameters are always in sync. So if we happen to maybe be referencing one of these parameters someplace else in our scene, we're always going to get the same string value back, no matter if we reference this collapsed version of the parameter or the expanded one. So let's walk through the steps of how we'll keep them in sync manually, and then work on programming that to happen automatically when we change this toggle. To start off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear this out, and then I'm going to alt-click the parameter to create a keyframe. And then I'm going to right-click the collapse parameter, head to copy parameter, and then right-click the expanded version and hit paste relative references. And now we can see that we get exactly what we're typing up here because it's a relative reference to this parameter. The reason why I alt-clicked before channel referencing it was because I wanted it to be a proper HScript expression with a keyframe, because that's how Houdini is actually going to do it when we implement this in Python. So when we hit the toggle, we're going to want the opposite thing to happen. So let's see how we do that in reverse. I'm going to delete the channels on this parameter. I'm going to copy this parameter, and then I'm going to alt-click the collapsed version, and then I'm going to paste relative references on the collapsed version. And now we can see that it's actually a relative reference to the expanded one. And now if we evaluate it, we can see that both of the parameters are in sync, and it works just the same as the way we did it a second ago. So now that we see how it's going to work, let's write out those steps in Python to be run as a parameter callback every time we interact with the toggle. So first, we probably need to see where exactly do callbacks go. So if we click on the expanded toggle in the parameter interface window, we can see that there's a section here called callback script, and it has the Python logo right next to it. So you can write whatever Python code you want in here and it'll execute it. Our code's going to be a little bit bigger, so I don't really want to write it all in one line here. So let's actually create a fourth parameter, and let's just call it code. Let's make it a multi-line string too, and we're going to change this language dropdown to Python, because when we do that, we're going to be able to get some really nice syntax highlighting for free here. We can actually run whatever code we write inside of this block here directly as Python code using Python's exec function. So let's write something in here just for a test. Say print hello. And I'm going to quickly pull up the Python shell so we can see the output. And in order to actually make this run when we hit the toggle, we can come back to the expanded toggle here, and under the callback script, we'll type exec kwargs node dot parm code dot eval as string. String. And when I hit apply, when I hit the toggle here, we can see that every time I press the toggle, the shell prints hello, because that's what we told it to do here. So let's take a quick detour and explain exactly what this whole kwargs thing is all about. Simply put, kwargs is a dictionary that Houdini makes available to us in many places, like callbacks and action buttons and menu scripts. And it gives us a set of key value pairs that tells us some things, in this case, info about the parameter that the callback was executed from. And we use it here to find out which node we're running this code from so that we can get parameters from that particular instance of the node in our scene. So let's actually just quickly see what we get with kwargs. So if I just say print kwargs and I toggle the expanded key, we can see that we get this Python dictionary with a whole bunch of really useful information in there for us. So we can see what node this was run from, what parameter it was run from. If it's part of a multiparm block, we can know what the number suffix it has, and we get the parameter name as a string, and all sorts of really interesting stuff that we could use for all different types of coding. So now that we know that the callback is all hooked up and working, and we have a little bit of an idea what kwargs means, let's write out our actual code. So I'm going to delete what we got going on in here. And I'm going to start by defining a function called toggle expand. And toggle expand is going to take the current node as an argument. And I'm going to make a variable called expanded. And that's going to be node, so this current node, and get the parameter called note expanded. And then I'm going to make another variable called collapsed. And that's going to be equal to the parameter called note collapsed. And I'm going to store both of these parameters in a list. Call it parms equals collapsed and expanded. So that'll become more apparent in just a second. So let's walk through the steps that we did earlier. First, I'm going to say parms 0, which is that collapsed parameter. I'm going to say delete all keyframes. So that's going to remove any sort of expressions that we might have in there. And then I'm going to do the same for the expanded version, parms 1. And then I'm going to say parms 1, which is the expanded version in this case, set parms 0. And so it's very important to note that we're going to set the value of one parameter not to the value of the other parameter, but to the parameter itself. If we wanted to set this to be the actual string that was in there, we would say parm.eval, but we don't actually want that. We want to set it to the actual parameter object because under the hood, Houdini is going to make this relative reference for us for free. And we want to take advantage of that by just parm object and not the parm value. One final thing we need to do though is this only works in one direction because we're setting collapsed and we're removing the keyframes on collapsed and we're setting the expanded version to the collapsed version. But what happens when the toggle is switched the other direction? What we can do is we can check the value of the toggle and reverse the array based on whether or not it's expanded or collapsed currently. So we'll say if node.eval parm expanded. So if the checkbox is on, let's just reverse that array. And now parms 0 would actually be the expanded version and parms 1 would be the collapsed. So the final thing we need to do is actually call this function because all we've done right now is define it. So at the bottom here, we'll say toggle expand kwargs node because we'll get past that kwargs dictionary when we run this as a callback. Now let's watch what happens when I toggle this button here. We can see that it's switching the relative reference from the expanded and collapsed version, which is exactly what we want. If we just keep typing some stuff here, we can see that they stay in sync perfectly. So if I type something here and untoggle it, we can see that they're staying perfectly in sync and we're always going to have the same value in both string parameters. So now we're really close to having our base version done. Let's just add some action buttons and tidy up the interface. Action buttons are the little buttons to the right side of a parameter, and you're probably most familiar with using them when doing stuff like group selections on a blast node or something. The action button won't actually show up until we start adding things to the action button tab of the edit parameter interface window for our particular parameters. All we want our action buttons to do is set the value of this toggle to either 0 or 1. And we could just leave this toggle, but I find that the action button is just a little bit cleaner in the interface. So let's start by adding an action button script to our collapsed node. First, I'm going to grab that toggle parameter by saying parm equals kwargs node.parm expanded. And then I'm just going to set that to a value of 1. And when I hit apply, we can see that this gear button shows up next to our parameter. And when I press it, it changes the toggle to a value of 1. If I press it again, nothing happens because we told it to explicitly set it to a value of 1 and not to actually toggle it. So let's copy this and head over to note expanded and paste it. Change that 1 to a 0, hit apply, and now we can see we get an action button on our expanded parameter. And when I hit it, it changes the toggle to a value of 0. So it's close, but if you look closely, we can see that it's not actually working. The parameter references aren't switching like they do when we actually hit the toggle. That's because the parameter callbacks don't actually run when we only call parm.set. We need to simulate the pressing of the button in order to get the callback to run too. And this is really simple to add. So at the bottom here, I'm just going to say parm.press button. And I'm going to copy that and head over to note collapsed and paste it and hit apply. And now when I press these action buttons, it's simulating that we've actually pressed the toggle ourselves. And it's running that callback and causing our parameters to do that reference switching like we built in earlier. So finally, let's change the gear icon to something a bit more informative, like some arrows. If we head down here to the action icon section, we can see that there's a gear, and that's the icon that we're currently showing on our parameter. So let's click this, and it's going to take us to the normal file chooser, but every file chooser includes this section here called H icon. An H icon has every icon that exists in Houdini ready for you to use whenever you want to use it. So unless you're making your own custom SVG files, I would always default to using these nice Houdini icons that you get for free. I like to come down here to this show files matching and start typing what I think I'm looking for. So I'll come in here and I'll type star keys because I know there's some nice up and down arrows inside this keys section here. And if I start looking, I can see that we have a keys up and we have a keys down. So let's go ahead and grab this keys down.svg and hit accept. And right here at the bottom, we don't actually need to have the .svg. And we also don't need to have this whole path either. We can get these icons just by typing the name of it, keys_down. I'll hit enter and head over to note expanded. And I'll do the same thing, but I already know that there's a keys up. So I'm just gonna type keys up and we get an arrow that points up. And when I hit apply, we can see that our action buttons change to a down arrow and an up arrow, which are a lot more useful than just that default gear. So the last things for us to do are to add back in that hide when expression and make some stuff invisible. So let's go back to note collapsed, head to the parameter tab, and in hide when, we're gonna say hide when expanded is equal to 1. I'm gonna copy this. And for note expanded, we wanna hide it when expanded equals 0. I also don't really care about seeing all this code here. So let's come to code, make this invisible. And also let's make our toggle invisible because we don't actually need to see it. So when I hit apply, we're left with basically our final product. We've got a single line. When we hit the down arrow, it expands. And when we hit the up arrow, it collapses. One final tweak, just to make it a little bit nicer looking, is to try and get this note label to line up slightly better with the expanded label. You can see that when it's collapsed, note here is pretty far indented. And when it's expanded, it's all the way over here to the left. We can cheat this by adding a blank label parameter in front of our collapsed parameter. So let's come here and I'm going to grab a label parameter and I'm going to drop it right on top of note collapsed. And I'm going to turn on this button here that says horizontally join to next parameter. That way they're going to butt up right next to each other in the interface. And when I hit apply, we can see it actually made the problem quite a bit worse. But when I come here and I make this label invisible, it actually sucks the note right all the way over to the left side. So now when we expand it and collapse it, there's not so much of a visual jump. Finally, what I like to do is I don't like to leave this as just a blank label because it doesn't really make much sense when you start looking at it in the interface here. So I always come in here and I name it something like justify left and let's call it justify left. We'll never see that, but it's just nice for when you're looking in the interface here. You wonder what this blank label is supposed to do. Now you know. And that's our expandable and collapsible note. If you want to stick around a little bit longer, I'm going to show just a few lines we need to modify to get this working in a multiparm block like we saw at the beginning of the video. So I'm going to start by duplicating our existing setup. Let's name this one single, and we'll name this one multiparm. And let's edit the parameter interface for this one. And I'm going to show the invisible parameters, and let's just start adding the multiparm block. So first we'll add a folder and set its folder type to multiparm block list. And we'll call this folder notes and with a label of notes. And I'm going to grab all of our parameters except for the code block here, and I'm going to move them into that notes folder. And when I hit apply, we can see that we wind up with this multiparm block here. And all of our parameters, now their names have this hash after it. And if I add a parameter here, we can see that the names of the parameters are now note collapsed 1. If we add a few more, we can see we get note collapsed 1, note collapsed 2, and so on. That's because it needs to add numbers to the end of each parameter to make sure each one is unique inside of this block. When we create a bunch of instances like this and we look in the edit parameter interface, we can still see that there's only one version of these. There's not two, or if we add even more, we don't get a bunch added to the parameter interface here. They're just instances of one version of that parameter here. Unfortunately, this name change made pretty much all of our code logic break. Luckily, it's really easy to fix. So the first thing let's fix is that hide when syntax. So now we don't have a parameter called expanded. We have a parameter called expanded hash. So we'll change that to expanded hash, and we'll change the other one to expanded hash. And when I hit apply, now we're only seeing one version of the string parameter. If we try to expand it, we get an error. None type has no attribute set. Let's show our code again and take a look. We can see that we're looking for a parameter called note expanded, but that doesn't exist anymore. So we're going to have to actually account for all these new number suffixes on the end of our parameters here. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by taking another argument and call it something like parm index. And instead of looking for a parameter called note expanded, we're going to look for a parameter called note expanded plus a string version of that parameter index, which is just going to be a number from 0 to whatever. So we add it to that expanded variable. In this method right here, by just adding a plus string parm index here, this will work in Python 2 and 3. But if you're only using Python 3, you can use f strings, which are a lot cooler, by adding an f before the quotes, adding some curly braces inside, and just putting parm index inside of those curly braces. The last place we need to modify it is in the expanded toggle here. So we'll say f string expanded parm idx. And finally, at the bottom here, when we call toggle expand, we want to know what the multiparm index of the parameter is where this callback is being called from. So we can get that by using the kwargs dictionary again and looking up script multiparm index. Nice. So now when we hit our button here, it should work, but it doesn't, because there's one other place where we need to do this exact same trick of grabbing that script multiparm index, and that's on the action button itself. So let's head over to the action button script, and up here at the top, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Up here at the top, let's store that index in a variable just to keep things clean. I'm going to say idx equals kwargs script multiparm index. And instead of looking up that expanded toggle, we're going to look up expanded idx. Let's come over to our note expanded. I'm going to copy the top line here, make a little bit of room, paste it, and again, this time let's do it the Python 2 way just to show that again. Plus str idx. And if I hit apply, we should hopefully see our buttons expanding and collapsing our parameters. Awesome. So we are very close to making this work. Let's go ahead and hide the code again because we don't need to see it. And if we start typing, we're going to see we have one final problem to deal with. When I expand it and collapse it, it works. If I clear all this out and try it again, and I expand it, we see that our string disappeared. Let's undo the hide when again, just so we can see what's going on. So we'll remove it from these two. I'll hit apply. Clear this out. Let's make a fresh note. So the problem is that from the very beginning, this expanded note needs to be referencing the collapsed note. Otherwise, it will only start working after we have expanded and collapsed this once. So let's see what that looks like. If I hit the expand button, nothing happens. If I hit it here, we can see that the links have been made, so that's great. And now we start typing again. Now it works, and it'll keep working. But we have to do it at least once, and that doesn't make any sense because you lose whatever you typed into the box. We can fix this really easily by clearing this out, coming to note expanded, and under channels, setting its default to be an H script expression that links itself to that note collapsed parameter with the hash after it. So it always matches up to the right instance in the multiparm. And when I hit apply and hit plus, we can see now from the very beginning, this is linked to the collapsed version. And if I start typing, they're all married up together, just how we'd expect them to be. So great, let's go back and hook up that hide when expression one last time. Hide when expanded hash equals 0. Copy that and hide the collapsed version when it equals 1. Hit apply, clear it out just to be sure. And we can see that our expanded and collapsed version is working. Hooray! Awesome. And that's it. So this is my first video, and I hope you guys found it useful, and thanks a lot for watching.